The dust of the settlement tasted like failure. Kalen felt it on his tongue, a gritty film that the wind carried up from the flat, sun-baked street. He stood by the water trough, his pack mule sighing beside him, the noise a soft complaint in the oppressive heat. He hated this place. He hated the closeness of it, the way the buildings leaned in, the murmur of voices a constant, grating hum against the silence he was used to. But the salt and the iron rivets he needed could only be found here, so twice a year, he endured. He finished loading the last of his supplies, his movements economical and sure. His hands, calloused and scarred from a life lived by the axe and the knife, secured the canvas cover over his goods. He thought only of the trail back up into the high peaks, of the scent of pine and cold stone, of the profound quiet that was his only companion. The grief that lived in that quiet was a familiar ache, a ghost he knew how to live with. It was the noise of the world below that threatened to tear the old wounds open. Then he heard it. Not the usual din of commerce or the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. It was a different sound. A woman's cry, sharp and thin, cut short. Followed by a man's voice, thick with self-righteous fury. Kalen did not want to look. He had learned long ago that the affairs of others were traps, snares of obligation and pain that he had no room for in his carefully constructed solitude. He had a duty only to the memory of a woman's laugh and the phantom weight of a small child on his back. Nothing else. But he did look. His gaze, drawn against his will, settled on the small crowd gathered near the general store. In the center of the circle stood Silas Blackwood, a man whose ambition was as plain as the sweat staining his collar. Before him, on her knees in the dirt, was a young woman. Kalen recognized her vaguely as Blackwood's sister-in-law, the one whose husband had been taken by a fever that spring. Ilara. Ilara cowered, one arm shielding her face while the other was wrapped protectively around a crude wooden crate. From inside the crate came the thin, mewling cries of infants. Twins. He'd heard the whispers on his way into town. A bad omen, some had said. A sign of a faithless wife. She has shamed our name, Silas boomed, his voice pitching to carry across the dusty square. He held up a leather-bound ledger. My brother left this world with debts. Debts this woman, with her unnatural brood, cannot hope to repay. She is a drain. A curse. Kalen's jaw tightened. The word curse struck a dissonant chord deep inside him. He remembered the whispers after his own Sarah had passed, taking their boy with her. He remembered the looks of pity that felt like accusation. Silas grabbed Ilara by the arm, hauling her roughly to her feet. The crate tipped, and the crying from within grew more frantic. But I am a merciful man, Silas declared, a smug, cruel twist to his lips. Her debt can be worked off. Mr. Gable here has need of a scullery maid. He will take her on, and the children, until her husband's slate is clean. A portly man with a leering gaze stepped forward, nodding. Indentured servitude. It was a prettier word for what he truly meant. Kalen saw the terror in Ilara's eyes, the way her body trembled. She looked from Silas to Gable, then to the faces in the crowd, finding no help, no mercy. Only morbid curiosity and the quiet condemnation of her peers. Her gaze, for a fleeting second, met Kalen's. He saw not just fear but a depth of despair so profound it felt like a physical blow. It was the look of a soul that had given up. And in that moment, something within him, a lock that had been rusted shut for 5 long years, broke. He did not think. He moved. His body, conditioned by the unforgiving mountains, covered the distance in a few long, silent strides. The crowd parted for him, sensing the change in the air, the sudden charge of a storm about to break. He was larger than most men in the town, hardened by a life they could not imagine. He stopped directly in front of Silas, his shadow falling over the smaller man. He said nothing. He simply stood there, his presence a granite wall between Silas and the woman. Silas, flustered by the sudden appearance of the reclusive mountain man, puffed out his chest. This is a family matter. It does not concern you. Kalen's eyes, the color of a winter sky, did not blink. They were fixed on the ledger in Silas's hand. The debt, Kalen said. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. "How much?" Silas scoffed, recovering his bluster. "It is more than a man like you could ever possess. It is a matter of land, of accounts." He waved the book dismissively. "How much?" Kalen repeated, the words harder this time, each one a chip of ice. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Silas's face. He opened the ledger, a theatrical gesture for the crowd. $200. For supplies, for the doctor who could not save my brother, for the shame she has brought. A gasp rippled through the onlookers. It was a fortune. An impossible sum. Kalen reached into the leather pouch at his belt. His movements were slow, deliberate. He pulled out a small deerskin bag, heavy with the profits from a winter's worth of prime pelts. He loosened the drawstring and poured a stream of gold and silver coins into his palm. He had been saving it for a new rifle, for things he did not truly need. He counted out the sum, the clink of the coins the only sound in the now silent square. He held the money out to Silas. "There." Silas stared at the coins, his greed warring with his surprise. He snatched the money, his eyes gleaming. "Well, the debt is paid. But the woman and her issue are still a matter for the family." "No," Kalen said. The word was absolute. He looked from Silas to the woman, Ilara, whose face was a mask of disbelief and terror. He saw the two tiny beings she protected. An echo of a cradle he had once carved. An ache that was almost unbearable. He turned his gaze back to the crowd, to the sheriff who watched from the edge, his face troubled but his hand still at his sides. "I have bought the debt," Kalen declared, his voice ringing with a power no one in that town had ever heard from him. "So I will take the burden." He looked directly at Ilara, at the crate with her children. A fierce, protective instinct he thought long dead roared to life in his chest. "I will be their father." Ilara felt the world tilt on its axis. The dust, the jeering faces, the suffocating heat, it all receded, replaced by the towering presence of the man before her. The mountain man. She had seen him before, a fleeting, intimidating figure who came and went like a season. He was a creature of myth as much as a man, a story parents told their children to keep them from wandering too far into the woods. And he had just spoken words that made no sense. "I will be their father." The phrase hung in the air, impossibly heavy. It was not an offer, it was a declaration, as solid and unmovable as the mountains he came from. Silas sputtered, his face purpling with rage. "You can't, she is my brother's widow. It is my right, my duty." "You named your price," the mountain man cut in, his voice dangerously low. "The debt is paid. The rest is mine." He did not raise his voice, yet it silenced Silas completely. He turned his gaze to her, and for the first time, she saw something beyond the harsh, weathered exterior. In the depths of his grey eyes, there was a flicker of an ancient, banked pain. It was a pain she recognized. He knelt, his large frame moving with a surprising grace. He was not looking at her, but at the crude crate where her daughters, Lyra and Sarah, now fussed weakly. His large, calloused hand reached out, not to touch them, but to gently steady the box. The gesture was so tender, so at odds with his formidable appearance, that it shattered the last of her composure. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "Come," he said, his voice softer now, meant only for her. He stood and offered her a hand. She stared at it. It was a hand that knew hardship, a map of scars and strength. To take it was to step into an unknown far more terrifying than the future Silas had planned for her. It was to trust a ghost, a wild man. But to refuse it was to accept a slow death in Mr. Gable's kitchen, to watch her daughters grow up as property. Her own hand, trembling and weak, rose to meet his. His fingers closed around hers, his grip firm but not crushing. He pulled her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. Then, with his other hand, he lifted the crate containing her entire world. He held it with a reverence that stole her breath, cradling it against his chest. He turned and began to walk, leading her away from the stunned crowd, away from Silas's impotent fury, toward the edge of town where his mule waited patiently. She stumbled after him, her legs unsteady, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and a fragile, terrifying flicker of hope. The townspeople parted before them, their whispers following her like the rustle of dry leaves. She did not look back. The journey into the mountains was a blur of exhaustion and fear. Ilara followed the silent man, her body aching with a weariness that went bone deep. She carried Lyra, wrapped tightly in the one good blanket she owned, while the mountain man, Kaelin, she had heard the sheriff call him, carried Sarah in a makeshift sling against his chest, his other hand expertly guiding the pack mule up the winding, treacherous path. The air grew thinner, colder. The sun-baked dust of the town gave way to the sharp, clean scent of pine and damp earth. The world grew quiet, the only sounds the plodding of the mule's hooves, the whisper of the wind through the tall trees, and the soft noises of her babies. Kaelin did not speak. He moved with a relentless, steady pace, his eyes constantly scanning the trail ahead, the trees, the sky. He was a part of this wilderness, and she was an intruder in it. She watched him, searching for any sign of his intentions. His face was a mask carved from stone, his expression unreadable. Why had he done this? No man took on a widow with 2 infants out of charity. He had paid a fortune for them. What did he expect in return? The fear was a cold knot in her stomach. She was his property now, just in a different way. She had merely traded one cage for another, this one vaster and more isolated. They stopped only once, as twilight began to bleed through the canopy. He chose a small, sheltered clearing. Without a word, he took Sarah from the sling and passed the sleeping infant to her. Then he set about building a fire with an efficiency that was mesmerizing. He gathered wood, struck a spark, and coaxed a flame to life as easily as another man might breathe. He handed her a piece of hardtack and a strip of dried venison from his pack. She huddled by the fire, nursing her daughters one by one, her body shivering despite the heat. Kaelin sat on the other side of the flames, cleaning his knife with a slow, methodical motion. He did not look at her, yet she felt his awareness. He was like a wolf, conscious of every sound, every movement. When she finished, he took the empty water skin and disappeared into the darkness, returning minutes later with it full of cold, clear water. He left it by her side and resumed his silent vigil. He was her keeper. Her guard. It was nearly dawn when they arrived at his home. It was not a cabin so much as a fortress built of timber and stone, nestled into the side of a formidable peak. It was small, stark, and utterly isolated. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a lonely plume against the vast, indifferent sky. Inside, the space was dominated by a large stone hearth. A fire was already burning low, banked carefully to last. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and something else, the faint, lingering scent of solitude. The furniture was sparse and handmade, a sturdy table, 2 chairs, a bed built into the wall. It was impeccably clean, obsessively ordered. Kaelin placed the mule's packs on the floor and then turned to her. He gestured toward the bed, which was covered with thick furs. "For you." "The children." She hesitated, clutching Lyra tighter. Where would he sleep? As if hearing her unspoken question, he took a rough wool blanket from a chest and laid it on the floor near the hearth. That was his place. As far from her as the small cabin would allow. The first days were a silent truce. Ilara's world shrank to the needs of her daughters, nursing, changing, rocking. Her fear of Kaelin slowly subsided, replaced by a wary curiosity. He was a creature of routine. He rose before the sun, tended to his traps, chopped wood with a rhythmic, powerful swing of his axe, and returned at dusk. He would leave fresh water, firewood, and food, a cooked rabbit, a fish, a handful of foraged berries, on the table without a word and then retreat to his side of the room. He never intruded. He never stared. He never made a demand. But his presence was a constant, solid thing. She found herself watching him when he thought she was not. She saw the way he mended his tools, his large hands surprisingly deft. One afternoon, she watched from the window as he stood for a long time staring at a small, weathered wooden bird tied to the branch of a tree outside, his posture so full of sorrow it made her own heart ache. One evening, while Lyra fussed with a colic that would not break, Kaelan got up from his place by the fire. Ilara flinched, her body tensing as he approached. But he did not come near her. He went to a small, dusty chest in the corner, one she had not seen him open before. He lifted the lid and, after a moment's hesitation, pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden cradle. It was worn smooth with use, the rocker silent. He brought it over and set it gently on the floor near her. He did not look at her, his gaze fixed on the empty cradle. His jaw was tight, his throat working as if to swallow a great pain. He had made this for someone else. For the ghost of the child he mourned. Tears pricked her eyes. She carefully placed the crying Lyra into the cradle. As she rocked it, the baby's fussing slowly quieted, soothed by the gentle, rhythmic motion. Kaelan watched for a moment longer, his face a mask of anguish and memory. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the cabin, into the cold mountain night. She did not know where he went. She only knew he had given her a piece of his heartbreak, and in that shared silence, she felt the first, fragile tendril of trust begin to grow. Kaelan did not know how long he stood in the biting wind. The cold was a comfort, a familiar pain that drove out the other, sharper one. The sight of that tiny baby in that cradle, it was a collision of past and present that he could barely withstand. Sarah would have loved them. His little boy, Daniel, would have been fascinated by their smallness. The ghosts were louder tonight, their whispers carried on the wind that whipped down from the peaks. He had lived with them for 5 years. He had built this solitary life as a monument to their memory. Every sunrise was a reminder of the one they did not get to see. Every silent meal was a testament to their absence. He had thought his heart was barren ground, incapable of feeling anything new. He had been wrong. The fierce, primal urge he'd felt in the town square had not faded. It had followed him up the mountain. It lived in his cabin now, in the form of a wary young woman and 2 helpless infants. When he heard one of them cry in the night, his body jolted with an instinct he thought long buried. The need to protect. The need to provide. It was a terrifying, unwelcome resurrection of the man he used to be. The husband. The father. He finally went back inside, the cold clinging to his clothes. Ilara was asleep, slumped in the chair, her head resting on the edge of the cradle where Lyra and Sarah now slept peacefully side by side. A log in the hearth shifted, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He moved quietly, adding more wood to the fire, ensuring the warmth would hold through the night. He looked at Ilara's exhausted face, the dark circles under her eyes. She was so young. Too young for so much sorrow. His gaze fell upon her hands, resting limply in her lap. They were chapped and raw. The next day, he went out and collected the resin from a specific pine tree, melting it down with bear fat over the fire to create a pungent, healing salve. He left the small pot on the table, next to the morning's offering of bread and smoked fish. He did not mention it. He just left it there for her to find. A week turned into 2. A fragile rhythm established itself in the small cabin. Ilara began to lose some of the haunted look in her eyes. The color returned to her cheeks. She moved with more confidence, no longer flinching when he entered the room. She started to contribute to their silent household, mending his torn shirt with neat, precise stitches and boiling water with wild herbs she recognized from the forest's edge, filling the cabin with a clean, medicinal scent. One morning, Sarah developed a cough. It started small, but by evening it had become a harsh, rasping sound that tore at Ilara's nerves. The baby's skin was hot to the touch. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She tried all the remedies she knew, but nothing seemed to help. The fever was climbing. Kaelan watched from his side of the room, his stillness a stark contrast to her frantic movements. Finally, he spoke. There is a root. White willow. Grows by the fastest part of the creek. The bark helps a fever. Ilara looked up, her eyes wide with desperation. I don't know where that is. I will show you, he said simply. He bundled the sick child in the warmest furs and placed her carefully in Ilara's arms. Stay by the fire. Keep her warm. He was gone for over an hour, moving through the twilight with a speed she could not fathom. He returned with a handful of pale, stripped bark. He instructed her how to shave it and steep it in hot water, his words sparse and practical. She followed his directions, her hands shaking as she spooned the bitter tea into Sarah's mouth. They sat a long, silent vigil together that night. They were no longer on opposite sides of the room, but united by the small, struggling life between them. They were not a man and a woman, a captor and a captive. They were two people fighting a common enemy. Towards dawn, the fever broke. Sarah's breathing eased, and she fell into a deep, healing sleep. Ilara sagged with relief, the tension draining from her in a rush. She looked across the hearth at Kalen. His face, illuminated by the firelight, was etched with exhaustion and a profound, unguarded relief. "Thank you," she whispered. It was the first time she had initiated a conversation. He just nodded, his gaze distant. His eye strayed to the dusty chest in the corner. "My son," he said, his voice a raw whisper, "the fever took him in a single night. The herbs, they did not work for him." The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge of shared grief. For the first time, she did not see a frightening mountain man. She saw a father who had lost his child. She saw the truth of his sorrow, a mirror to her own. "I'm so sorry," she said, her own voice thick with emotion. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and his eyes held not just pain, but a flicker of connection. A shared understanding that went deeper than words. In that moment, the cabin did not feel like a cage. It felt like a sanctuary. A fragile, temporary peace. But peace, nonetheless. The peace was shattered by the sound of a horse. Kalen was outside splitting logs when he heard it, a sound so out of place in his world that he froze, axe in hand. It was not the steady plod of his own mule, but the labored tread of a town horse, unused to the steep terrain. He straightened, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the tree line below. A moment later, two figures emerged from the woods. The first was Sheriff Brody, his face grim and unhappy. The second was Silas Blackwood, a look of smug triumph on his face. Kalen's hand tightened on the axe handle. A low growl rumbled in his chest. He had known this was not over. Men like Silas did not yield. They festered. Ilara appeared in the doorway of the cabin, her face pale with dread. She had heard it too. She saw Silas, and all the color drained from her face. She instinctively stepped back, pulling the door almost shut behind her. "Kalen," the sheriff called out, his voice strained. He dismounted, keeping his horse between himself and Kalen. Silas remained in his saddle, looking down on them all with an air of restored authority. "I'm not here for trouble. But I have to do my duty." "What duty?" Kalen's voice was flat, cold. "Silas here filed a formal complaint," Brody said, looking miserable. "He claims you abducted his brother's widow. That you coerced her. He says the money you paid was just a down payment on a larger, ongoing debt is just uncovered." Silas smirked, tapping a fresh, leather-bound book tucked into his saddlebag. It was not the same ledger from before. This one was newer, cleaner. "The family accounts are complex," he said smoothly. "My brother was a trusting man. There are many more entries. The woman belongs with her family. Under my protection." "He's lying," Ilara's voice came from the doorway, thin but clear. "There was no other debt. He's making it up." The sheriff sighed, his gaze sympathetic but his posture unyielding. "I don't know what to believe. All I know is he has papers, and you are here with a man who is not your kin. By law, I have to ask you to come back to town with me. We'll have a hearing. Settle this proper." "She is not going anywhere," Kalen stated. It was not a request. "Don't make me deputize a posse, Kalen," the sheriff warned, his hand moving toward the pistol at his hip. "I don't want that." Nobody wants that. But Silas has rights under the law. We do this by the book. A hearing, in front of the town council, in 3 days' time. You can make your case there. If you don't show, I'll have to come back with more men. Caelan's eyes locked with Silas's. He saw the pure, venomous greed in the man's face. Silas wanted the land Ilara's husband had owned, a prime parcel bordering his own. The widow and her children were just an obstacle to be swept aside. The new ledger was a lie, a weapon forged to finish the job. He knew it. And he knew, with a sinking certainty, that in a battle of papers and laws, a man like him stood little chance against a man like Silas. But he looked back at the cabin, at the pale, terrified face of the woman who had just started to feel safe. He thought of the 2 infants sleeping inside, oblivious to the storm gathering around them. The promise he had made in the dusty town square echoed in his mind. I will be their father. A promise was a law more sacred than any written in a book. 3 days, Caelan said, his voice a low rumble. He lowered the axe, but did not release it. It was a concession, not a surrender. The sheriff nodded, relieved. He turned his horse and, without another word, led the triumphant Silas back down the mountain path. Caelan watched them go, the silence they left behind heavier and more threatening than their words had been. The sanctuary had been breached. The world was coming for them. Ilara felt the cold seep back into her bones. The warmth and safety of the past weeks evaporated like mist in the morning sun. Silas's smug face was burned into her mind. He would not stop. He would use his lies and his false ledgers until he had what he wanted. He would take her daughters, separate them, send her to a life of servitude. The law was on his side. The sheriff's reluctant but firm words proved it. Caelan came back inside, the chill of the encounter clinging to him. He looked at her, his face grim. He will not win. How? She whispered, her voice trembling. He has papers. He has the law. What do we have? We have the truth, he said simply. But they both knew the truth was often not enough. That afternoon, Caelan made a decision. He packed a small bag with dried meat and the healing salve he'd made. He looked at Ilara, his eyes holding a new resolve. There is someone in town. Martha. Runs the general store. She is a widow. She is fair. You will go to her. Stay with her. It is not safe for you here alone. And you? Ilara asked, her heart sinking at the thought of him leaving. I have something I must do, he said, his gaze distant and hard. An old path I need to walk. He would not say more. He checked the sky, the position of the sun. Leave at dawn. Follow the creek down. It is a longer way, but safer. It will bring you to the west side of town. Go to her store. Tell her Caelan sent you. He left without another word, melting into the forest like a shadow. Ilara was truly alone now, the silence of the cabin no longer a comfort, but a crushing weight. The trust she had placed in him was now a fragile thread stretching into the wilderness. The next morning, she did as he said. Bundling her daughters against the cold, she took the small amount of food he'd left and began the long journey down the mountain. The fear was a constant companion, every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sending a jolt of panic through her. But Caelan's quiet confidence had planted a seed in her. We have the truth. She arrived in town dusty and exhausted, a spectacle of a wild-looking woman with 2 infants. She avoided the main street, her heart pounding, and found her way to the general store. Martha, a woman with kind eyes and work-worn hands, was sweeping the front porch. She looked up as Ilara approached, her expression cautious. My name is Ilara, she began, her voice barely a whisper. Caelan sent me. Martha's expression softened immediately. She put down her broom and ushered Ilara inside, away from prying eyes. I was hoping he would, she said, her voice warm. The whole town is buzzing with Silas's lies. Come in, child. You are safe here. Martha's back room was a haven of warmth and the scent of cinnamon and cloves. She listened patiently as Ilara, her voice growing stronger with the telling, recounted everything. The cruelty of Silas, the impossible debt, the quiet kindness of the mountain man, the new ledger, the threat of the hearing. When she was finished, Martha sat for a long moment, her brow furrowed in thought. "Silas Blackwood is a greedy fool," she said finally. "But he's a cunning one. His new ledger, that's what will convince the council. A man's written word in a book is worth more than a woman's tears in this town." She paused, her eyes sharp. "But ink can be traced. Lies can be unraveled." Over the next 2 days, Martha became her champion. She did not broadcast Ilara's story, but she planted seeds. When a woman came in to buy flour, Martha would mention how strange it was that Silas had never spoken of these great debts while his brother was alive. When the blacksmith came for nails, she wondered aloud how a man could produce a perfect, new ledger for old accounts that should have been worn and battered. Martha encouraged Ilara to speak for herself. "They see a victim," she said gently. "Let them see a mother." The next day, when 2 of the councilman's wives were in the store, Ilara, her heart pounding, stepped out from the back room. She did not cry. She did not plead. She simply stood before them, holding one of her daughters, and said, "Silas Blackwood says I shamed my husband's name by birthing 2 daughters. He wants to take them from me." She showed them the fading bruise on her arm, a remnant of that day in the square. It was not the bruise that moved them, but the quiet dignity with which she displayed it. It was the fierce, protective love in her eyes as she looked at her child. The women left the store in silence, their faces thoughtful. The narrative was beginning to shift. The community's conscience, so easily swayed by Silas's loud pronouncements, was beginning to stir. Meanwhile, high in the mountains, Caelan followed a path he had not walked in 5 years. It led to the ruins of his old cabin, the one he had shared with Sarah and Daniel. It had been struck by lightning the year after they died, a final, cruel blow from fate. He had abandoned it, building his new, sterile fortress further up the peak, away from the memories. Now, he sifted through the wreckage. He was not looking for sentiment. He was looking for proof. Sarah had been the bookkeeper for their small homestead. She had documented everything in a simple, cloth-bound journal, every pelt sold, every transaction with the town, every dealing with their neighbors, including Silas Blackwood's brother, who had often traded labor for supplies. He found the book, miraculously preserved in a charred wooden box that had fallen into a dry, protected crevice. The pages were yellowed and water-stained, but the ink was still legible. He spent hours under the open sky, his finger tracing Sarah's neat script, his heart a dull ache in his chest. He found what he was looking for. Entries detailing the lumber and grain they had given to Silas's brother. And next to them, the corresponding entry, debt paid in full. Handshake and thanks from a good neighbor. There were 3 such entries. Caelan closed the book. This was not a weapon of law, like Silas's ledger. It was a weapon of truth. It was his wife's voice, reaching across the years. It was the word of the dead against the lies of the living. He tucked the book safely inside his coat and started the long walk back toward the town. He would be there for the hearing. The day of the hearing dawned gray and cold. The town hall, which also served as a church, was crowded. The air was thick with anticipation and judgment. Ilara sat on a hard wooden bench near the front, Martha beside her. Her daughters were asleep in the back room, watched over by the blacksmith's wife, a woman who had offered her help that morning with a look of quiet solidarity. Ilara's fear was a living thing, but for the first time, it was matched by a sliver of resolve. Silas stood before the town council, a panel of 3 somber-faced men. He was in his best suit, his face a mask of pious concern. He held up his pristine new ledger. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and practiced, "this is a sad duty. I wish only to honor my brother's memory and protect his widow from her own misfortune. But the debts are clear. He owed money for seed, for tools, for services. It is all documented here." He opened the book, its pages crisp and white. "The total is substantial. Far more than the pittance the mountain man threw at my feet." He spun his tale, painting Ilara as incompetent, a burden, and himself as the reluctant savior, forced to make a hard decision for the family's own good. He claimed Kaylin was a violent brute who had taken advantage of a hysterical woman. Some in the crowd nodded along. The law, the numbers, the written word, it was all on his side. The law is clear, Silas concluded, closing the book with a righteous snap. She is to be returned to my care, her assets used to clear the family name. It is my right. The head councilman, a stern rancher named Miller, looked over at Ilara. Mrs. Blackwood, do you have anything to say to this? Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. Martha gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. She stood, her legs trembling. She did not look at Silas. She looked at the faces in the crowd, the women she had spoken to, the men whose wives had come home with questions in their eyes. My name is Ilara, she said, her voice shaking at first, then gaining strength. I am not Mrs. Blackwood. I am a mother. My husband was a good man. He was not a debtor. She took a deep breath. He and Silas, they did not get along. My husband believed Silas was cheating his neighbors. He told me to be wary of him. A murmur went through the crowd. The day my husband was buried, she continued, her voice ringing with clarity, Silas came to me with a ledger. He said I owed him. When I told him I had no money, he tried to force himself on me. I fought him off. That is when he swore he would ruin me. That is when he declared me indebted and cursed for bearing daughters. Silas leaped to his feet. Lies. Hysterical rantings from a grieving, unstable woman. Then let us look at your ledger, a new voice said. It came from the back of the hall. The crowd turned as one. Kaylin stood in the doorway, his frame filling it. He was not wild and disheveled, but clean, his hair tied back. He looked formidable, solid as the mountain he came from. He walked forward, not with menace, but with a slow, deliberate purpose. He stopped beside Ilara, a silent, unshakable pillar of support. He held up the charred, cloth-bound book he had recovered. This was my wife's journal, he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. She recorded everything, including our dealings with Ilara's husband. He was an honest man. He opened the book and laid it on the table before the council. He and I traded. He was a skilled carpenter. He built my animal pens. I gave him cured meat and furs in exchange. No money. No debt. My wife recorded it. Signed and dated. He then turned to Silas. Your brother died in April. Some of the debts in your new book, he said, his eyes like chips of ice, are dated for May and June of this year. You are claiming your brother bought seed from you 2 months after he was in the ground. A collective gasp filled the hall. All eyes flew to Silas, whose face had gone pale as milk. He snatched his ledger, fumbling through the pages, his composure shattering. It's a clerical error. A mistake in the dates. Let me see that book, the blacksmith called out from the crowd. He was a man trusted by all. He strode forward and took the ledger from Silas's trembling hands. He flipped through the pages, his expert eye scanning the entries. He stopped at one page and grunted. This is my mark, the blacksmith announced, pointing to a crude signature. For shoeing his horse. I remember the day. It was last winter. But this ink, this is new ink. Not 6 months old. And this is not the book I signed. The one I signed was old and dirty. He looked up, his eyes full of contempt. This book is a fraud. And so are you, Silas. The dam broke. The community support, which had been a quiet stream, became a flood. Voices rose from all over the hall. A farmer shouted that Silas had tried a similar trick on him years ago. Another woman sobbed that he had shortchanged her on her husband's estate. The councilmen looked at each other, their faces hard with dawning realization. They were not just witnessing a family dispute. They were witnessing the unmasking of a town predator. Sheriff Brody stepped forward, his face set like granite. he took the fraudulent ledger from the blacksmith and held it up. "Silas Blackwood," he said, his voice booming with renewed authority, "you are a liar and a cheat. You have preyed on the weak and disgraced your own family. Get out of this town. If I see your face here again, I will personally lock you in a cell for fraud and perjury." Defeated and exposed, Silas stared around at the sea of hostile faces. There was no support for him here. No one to swindle, no one to fool. With a snarl of hatred directed at Elara and Kalen, he turned and fled the hall, the sound of the community's scorn following him out the door. A quiet fell over the room. The head councilman stood. "Elara," he said, his voice full of respect. "You and your children are welcome in this community. You are under its protection. You owe no one anything." He then looked at Kalen, his expression one of awe. "And you, sir? This town owes you a debt." Kalen simply nodded. He looked at Elara, whose face was wet with tears, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming relief. He had not just saved her. He had given her the chance to save herself. Her voice, her truth, had been the weapon that won the day. That evening, they traveled back up the mountain. The journey felt different. It was not a flight from danger, but a return home. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the silence of the high peaks was no longer threatening, but peaceful. When they reached the cabin, a fire was already burning in the hearth. Martha and the blacksmith had ridden up ahead of them, stocking the small home with food, blankets, and 2 new, beautifully made cradles that sat side by side. It was a gift from the town. An apology and a promise. After they had gone, a comfortable quiet settled over the cabin. Elara put her sleeping daughters into their new beds, her heart full. She turned to find Kalen standing by the hearth, watching her, his expression unguarded, his posture relaxed for the first time she could remember. "You are safe here," he said. It was not a declaration of his power to protect her, but a simple statement of fact. A truth they had forged together. "This is your home, Kalen," she said softly. "Your solitude. We have invaded it." He shook his head, a small, slow movement. He looked from her to the 2 cradles, and a gentle, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. The ghost of his grief was still there, but it was no longer a torment. It was just a quiet part of him, making room for something new. "It was not solitude," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It was emptiness. You have filled the quiet." He stepped closer, his gaze meeting hers, clear and certain. He reached out, not to touch her, but gesturing to the sleeping infants. "I meant what I said in the town," he said. "If you will have me." His voice was low, earnest, stripped of all its harshness. "I will be their father." Elara looked at this man, this quiet giant who had faced down her demons, who had honored his ghosts, who had offered her not a cage, but a sanctuary. She saw her future not as one of servitude or fear, but of partnership and peace. She saw a father for her daughters. She saw a home. Tears of gratitude welled in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. The word was full of hope, a promise of a new beginning. In the heart of the great, lonely mountains, a family had been born, not of blood, but of courage, kindness, and choice. A home built on a foundation of truth,